I got it. Okay.
All right. Broadcasting. Welcome, everyone. As we're letting folks roll in, we'll get things started here in the next couple of minutes. But while we're waiting for other folks to join us, if you wouldn't mind throwing your name and where you're calling in from into the chat function, I'll get that started here for everyone as an example. Oh, cool. Some familiar faces on. Heidi, Jill, good to see you.
Rebecca from Gilroy, California. Howdy, Rebecca. Damon, St. Louis. All right, welcome. Heidi.
Hi, Heidi. Hope you're doing well. Good. Daniela. Oh, all the way from London. Awesome.
Good evening, Daniela. That's fabulous. It's always great to have folks from outside the U.S. on these podcasts, on these webinars.
Absolutely. Mona Lisa from Greensboro, North Carolina. Awesome. Thanks for joining. Just give it another minute or two for folks, and then we can get rolling. Okay, Gary?
Yeah, well, and while we're doing that, if you have any, if you have a mind to, it'd be great if you could just throw in the chat, like what you want to get out of this. Like, you know, are you an educator? Are you a consultant? Are you an organizational leader? You know, just that would kind of help us just kind of tune in.
Absolutely.
Nonprofit founder. Awesome. Thank you, Shamil.
Fabulous.
Trainer, Kansas City. Thanks, Judy.
Awesome. Small business launch counselor, Tyler. Awesome. That's great.
Yep.
Cool.
Nonprofit social impact investor.
Awesome.
Yep. Oh, there we go. Director of DC Women's Business Center. Seriously thinking about using Eli training for the justice impacted demographic in DC. Oh, we got some stuff to talk about, Heidi. That's awesome. Students of entrepreneurship. Okay, great. Student of entrepreneurship. Thank you, Rebecca.
Awesome, Rebecca. That's great. Okay. You ready, Gary, to get things rolling?
Yep. Business counselor. I'm still looking at some of these comments here. Educator and counselor have created amazing parenting training. Great. Thank you, Sandra Leonard.
Wow. Fantastic.
Mediator and career readiness consultant. Awesome, Lydia. Thank you.
Awesome.
Pretty wide scope of folks here.
Yeah. Really excited to see such a diverse group joining us. This is really exciting.
Yep.
All right. Okay. Without further ado, let's get things rolling. I'm gonna mute myself, but we'll have two Q&A sessions, one in the middle and one at the end. So if you have any questions, just feel free to post those in the chat or the Q&A function. Either's fine, and I'll read those out to Gary and the audience at those breaks. If it's anything more on the technical side of things, I'll be sure to answer that privately. And then if it's more philosophical or about the program itself, we'll bring those to Gary and the audience. Take it away, Gary.
Good. Ready to go? All right. Thank you, Nick. Let me get my screen going up here. Whoops, that's not what I was trying to do. There we go. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm super excited to share some things about the entrepreneurial mindset with you. My name is Gary Schoeniger. I'm the founder and CEO of the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. So this journey, I just want to start, can I give you a little brief background here? This journey started for me almost 30 years ago, to be 30 years ago next month. January of 1991, I was reading the newspaper in the morning, and as a fledgling entrepreneur myself, I saw the story in the paper about a man that had lost his job, and it was like sort of a human interest story in the metro section. Guy lost his job. It's not coming back. His unemployment's running out. Afraid of losing his home. His wife's pictured there with him. You know, she's working 2 jobs, 2 shifts at a local dairy mart or convenience store or something to try to hold it together. And I was struck with this idea that you know, I could see opportunities everywhere. And I couldn't understand why this guy couldn't see the opportunity. So I asked myself this question, like, why can I see opportunity and he can't? So I was making some assumptions that I'm no smarter than this guy. It's just that my brain has adapted differently because I'm functioning in different environment. And because of my entrepreneur experience, I learned to think differently. And I began to ask myself if I could somehow deconstruct the mindset and the methods of an everyday entrepreneur. You know, people who don't have access to resources, you know, advanced degrees or you know, big world-changing ideas, venture capital and so forth. How do ordinary people who have no particular advantage in life manage to recognize, evaluate, and bring ideas to life? How do they do that? And that was the question. You know, the question really came to me as if I could sort of deconstruct the mindset and the methods of the what I would call the unlikely entrepreneurs or the everyday entrepreneurs, this could be useful to other humans and not just useful to people that want to start a business, that it could be useful to, you know, a much broader sphere of influence in a much broader way. It could be useful to people. So that's how this journey began. It was 1991. I started to interview entrepreneurs. I began to read biographies. Ultimately, I wound up interviewing hundreds of entrepreneurs around the world, studying as the patterns began to emerge, the common logic and the controllable factors, if you will, the common logic and the beliefs and the behaviors of these entrepreneurs. I began to look at in the scientific research around the behavioral studies, you know, behavioral psychology, social psychology, sociology, to explain what I could only describe as a phenomenon. And that's really what I want to talk about with you all today. So as I mentioned, I am the founder and CEO of a company called ELI. It's the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. We are the world's leading provider of entrepreneurial mindset education, courseware, keynotes, workshops, and professional development programs. We serve a broad audience, academic institutions, nonprofits, corporate clients, government agencies around the world. So in this webinar, I want to hit on 4 key things. I want to talk about redefining entrepreneurship in a very simple and a very fundamental way, as I like to say, like break it down into first principles. So just very simple definition of entrepreneurship. I want to talk about the entrepreneurial skills that the world now demands and sync those ideas up. I want to explore the critical dimensions of an entrepreneurial mindset. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about how to create effective entrepreneurial learning environments using our Ice House Entrepreneurship Program as an example. Now, my hope is that you can benefit from this webinar, whether or not you use our curriculum. Of course, you know, we would be delighted if you did, but we want this webinar to have utility regardless of whether or not you use our particular courseware. We want you to come away with this understanding understanding the basics on how to to develop an entrepreneurial mindset in yourself and others. So I'm going to start by redefining entrepreneurship in a way that anyone can embrace. But first, you know, where are we in the world, right? Why is this relevant now? You know, I found a term recently. It's called VUCA, which is an acronym, a military acronym that stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. That we're now living in this VUCA world, And we're living in a world that's changed in ways that now require everyone to think like an entrepreneur, whether or not they intend to start a business. And that's a really fundamental premise I need to make here. You can be innovative and entrepreneurial and not own a business. And further, I'm going to make the point that entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills are the very attitudes, behaviors, and skills that employers now demand. So I'll try to sync that up in a minute here. But the world has changed in ways that require everyone to think like an entrepreneur. And I think it's important to remember that if you have 100 random people in a room, and you say, how many people want to start a business? Maybe 30, 40 hands will go up if you're lucky, right? But if you have 100 people in a room and you say, how many people want to discover an opportunity, right? Every hand's going to go up. So and that's sort of a little clue to the way I'm going to define entrepreneurship, but I'm getting ahead of myself. All right. So a way to say this is that the mindset that once enabled us to succeed within highly stable, other-directed, rule-bound systems is distinct from the mindset that will enable us to adapt and thrive in today's rapidly changing world, right? Another way of thinking about this is it's not just new skills, it's new attitudes, deeply held beliefs and assumptions that also need to change. So when we look at entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills, what we tend to find are certain people who are highly resilient and they're highly resourceful. These are highly adaptable people who can identify and solve problems when the rules aren't clear and the path is not well defined, right? And there is unlimited global demand for people who can think like an entrepreneur. There will always be global demand for people that can think like an entrepreneur. As the Ted Dintersmith, the author of What Schools Could Be, is known for saying is that why do we keep teaching students to compete with artificial intelligence? That's a fool's errand, right? Nevertheless. When we look at the attitudes and skills of the entrepreneur, we see the resilience, the resourcefulness, the creativity, the critical thinking. What we see are attitudes, behaviors, and skills that we not only want to develop in ourselves, but we wish to cultivate in our children, in our students, and in our workforce and our citizens, right? So that's really the point here, that the value of learning how to think like an entrepreneur not only empowers the individual to adapt and thrive in a rapidly changing world, but it also equips him or her with the attitudes and skills that will empower them to make a greater contribution to the organizations, the communities, and the societies they inhabit. The challenge is that our systems have not kept pace. Our systems of education have not kept pace with this new reality. And there are good reasons for that. I mean, among those reasons, of course, there are institutional inertia, and historically, throughout, human history, there's typically a lag as technological advancements, societal advancements, our institutions tend to lag behind. But one of the primary reasons that our systems of education have not kept pace is that the subject of entrepreneurship is still largely a mystery. It's widely misunderstood. It's narrowly defined, and so that's what I want to talk about a little bit now. That's one of the barriers to embracing entrepreneurship more broadly, is that we get bound up in the way in which we defined it. And as I'm saying here, our ability to embrace an entrepreneurial mindset is limited by the ways in which we define it. And so, I've got this down to, generally speaking, there's three basic buckets that we find when you say the word entrepreneur, it tends to conjure one of three basic or four basic responses. So a lot of people hear the word entrepreneur and they imagine the Silicon Valley whiz kids at Stanford or Harvard or whatever that come up with new ideas. They get venture capital investment, and off to the races they go. And so this is a very sort of a predominant view of entrepreneurship, and it's fine. Look, we need the high growth entrepreneurs, but it's important to keep in mind that these high growth, the venture-backed high growth entrepreneur is by far an exception rather than the rule. And I don't remember the exact number, but when we were at Kauffman, Dane Stangler, who was the head of research at Kauffman, said to me once that it was like a fraction of a single % of all new businesses are created with venture capital. So it's important to remind ourselves that of all new businesses that start, a tiny fraction of them are the venture-backed high growth type of business. The other challenge I have with this, and so at the same time, this model of entrepreneurship tends to dominate our thinking. It tends to dominate a lot of the entrepreneurial education initiatives we see in colleges and universities around the world. And again, that's fine, but we have to keep in mind that for the vast majority of our students, this model of entrepreneurship is either irrelevant or it's unrealistic and out of reach, right? It's like saying, don't ever pick up a baseball bat if you're not qualified for the major leagues. So I think that the challenge I have with this model of entrepreneurship is that it tends to skew our thinking about not only how to be entrepreneurial, but who can be entrepreneurial, right? It kind of conjures the image of the elite white male in an elite university with some big, tech background and some big idea. And it really skews our thinking in that regard. So the second bucket, when we hear the word entrepreneur, for some it conjures the image of a Main Street small business owner, right? And this is what we see, efforts like this we see in community colleges, small business development centers. And this is really an often overlooked aspect of entrepreneurship, that the vast majority, I can't remember, it was 96 or 94% of all new jobs are created by companies with 9 employees or less. Yet at the same time, we tend to look at the small business development sector as insignificant, right? When in fact, they're sort of the backbone of job creators in the United States, at least. I'm sure that's true elsewhere. The problem is, in some of these initiatives, they tend to treat a startup as if it's just a smaller version of a large corporation. And they tend to confuse entrepreneurial attitudes and skills with managerial attitudes and skills. And as I'm fond of saying, we must remember that the attitudes, behaviors, and skills required to discover an opportunity are quite distinct from the attitudes, behaviors, and skills required to exploit that opportunity. And of course, the former being entrepreneurial skills, the latter being managerial skills. So the third bucket, a lot of people hear the word entrepreneur and they think of it in a negative light. Like an entrepreneur is a huckster. It's someone who exploits others for his own gain, right? And look, there are great reasons for any of these three perceptions, right? Whether you think it's a high growth entrepreneur, a small business owner, or an evil bastard, there are certainly plenty of examples, right? The people, the evil bastard types are making headlines, right? And so that's, again, a visibility versus representation issue that skews our thinking about entrepreneurs. And again, I want to remind the audience that our research has really been about the everyday entrepreneur, that ordinary people who are doing innovative and entrepreneurial things that are not necessarily making headlines or millions and billions of dollars. But the real challenge is, so how do we define entrepreneurship for people who hears a word and say, well, I don't care about entrepreneurship. What does that have to do with me, right? I'm going to be a nurse, or I'm going to, I'm going to become a lawyer, or whatever. I don't need to learn about entrepreneurship. We've got to define it in a way that everyone can embrace. And so, after interviewing hundreds of entrepreneurs and analyzing their behavior and looking in the aggregate, I came up with a very simple definition. I sometimes laugh about this because it took me 25 years to come up with this definition. But I'm defining entrepreneurship as the self-directed pursuit of opportunities to create value for others. It's a really straightforward definition that anyone can embrace, right? So, the more useful we become, the better off we're likely to be. And so the self-directed nature of this is also very important. So Adam Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations, he said, we all live by exchanging, right? In a modern economy, we all live by making ourselves useful to other humans, right? And as I said, the more useful we become, the better off we're likely to be. So this is simply a definition that anyone can embrace. It's the self-directed pursuit of opportunities to create value for others. So hold that definition in mind. It's a simple definition. Anyone can embrace it. I want to move on to talking about some of the entrepreneurial skills the world now demands, and to sort of dovetail these two ideas together. So imagine that you're going to go out into the unknown. You're going to go out into the world with a sharp stick and some baling wire, and you're going to try to figure out how to make yourself useful to other humans, right? It's sort of the entrepreneurial, what I call the opportunity discovery process, right? So we're no longer learning how to make ourselves useful within known systems, right? In traditional education, we learn how to make ourselves useful within known systems. It's assumed that we're going to work in an established organization where the systems and the processes and the procedures are known, and we're going to fulfill a predetermined role. Now we have to step out into the unknown in a highly ambiguous, resource-constrained environment and figure out how to make ourselves useful. I want to point out for just a minute that the ambiguity, the high degree of ambiguity combined with the resource constraints are absolutely essential circumstantial factors that help develop the entrepreneurial attitude, behaviors, and skills. Without the ambiguity and without the resource constraints, you will not develop an entrepreneurial mindset, right? You need those two factors to create the mindset. That's a really important point. Those are actually situational factors that there are situational factors that actually forge the entrepreneurial mindset. So if you didn't have ambiguity, you would just be learning about a known system. And if you had access to resources, you wouldn't really have to think creatively or critically, right? The resources just can open the doors for you. So how do we survive? How do we make ourselves useful in this highly ambiguous, resource-constrained environment? I've broken it down into about 3 basic phases, right? There's the problem-finding phase, and that requires empathy, right? To understand problems or opportunities requires curiosity and observation and inquiry. It requires problem-solving skills, the ability to think creatively and critically, right? To experiment and adapt, to collaborate, to network, to learn how to communicate and become resourceful, to use whatever you have to start where you are and make it work. And lastly, it requires self-direction and self-regulation. It requires an internal locus of control. It requires the ability to tolerate ambiguity. I can't overemphasize that. It's a really subtle superpower. I'm fond of telling my adult children that you either learn to tolerate ambiguity or you will forever be at the mercy of someone who has. Need to learn how to learn on our own, to learn and unlearn and relearn, need to become self-aware, to reflect, and to think about our own thinking and to develop resilience, which also comes from our thinking. The resilience is rooted in our in self-talk, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The point here is that entrepreneurial skills are 21st century skills. These are the skills that the world now demands. These are the skills that employers demand. They don't call them entrepreneurial skills. They call them soft skills, which annoys me no end. I don't care what you call them. You know, they call them self-starter. They want people that can think critically and creatively and solve problems. Those are entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills. So now I want to talk a little bit about the critical dimensions of an entrepreneurial mindset. And this word mindset is a little bit tricky. It's not really a clinical term. It's an amorphous concept, and I'm going to try to simplify this and break it down here. And I want to begin by saying that we all have a mindset, yet few of us are aware of it, much less the ways in which it influences our behavior without our awareness. And that's the real key here. So, you know, what I'm attempting to do in this webinar is bring together two important concepts. And one is the entrepreneurial part of it. It's that the more useful you become, the better off you're likely to be. And you know, there's nothing, you know, we're encouraging people to figure out how to make themselves more useful to more people in whatever circumstances they happen to find themselves, right? But then we're adding to this the mindset as this mechanism, this underlying mechanism that can either hinder or enhance our ability to adapt and thrive. And so there, ergo, my definition of mindset, right? It's the deeply ingrained beliefs, assumptions, and mental models that either hinder or enhance our ability to adapt and thrive. So here's how our mindset works. On the surface is what we would call the visible artifacts and the observable behavior. That's the outcomes that your mindset is creating. Beneath the surface lies our explicit knowledge and our espoused values. This is what we know that we know, or we say that we value. But at the base of the iceberg lies our implicit knowledge, our deeply held values and taken for granted beliefs and assumptions, and tacit assumptions, excuse me, right? That's where the mindset lives. So one way of thinking about this is to say, okay, on the surface, like we all know someone that's complaining, that complains a lot, like an habitual complainer. And so that's the behavior that's observable. That's what shows up on the surface. If you talk to such a person, they'll talk about, well, you know, they'll talk about why they can't do what they want to do. You know, it's my wife, it's my husband, it's my kids, it's my professor, it's my boss. You know, I want to do all these cool things, but the world won't let me. Some version of that, right? But what's very often beneath the surface is a deeply held, mostly unconscious sense of powerlessness or a helpless orientation or an external locus of control, unbeknownst to the individual. That's not what they don't really understand that, right? But at the core of their mindset is these deeply held beliefs that are causing them to complain a lot. And you know, so another way to think about this is that what shows up on the surface, like never mind what you say, what you do speak so loudly, I can't hear what you say, right? Our behavior ultimately betrays our deepest values and beliefs, right? If you turn down the volume and blur the picture, you can see where people spend their time, their money, and so forth, what they focus on. You can get a sense of where their mindset is, regardless of what they say. So we look at 5 critical dimensions of a mindset, whether it's entrepreneurial or non-entrepreneurial. We look at 5 core dimensions. The first and most important are self-efficacy beliefs, right? So someone has high self-efficacy beliefs, is highly confident in their ability to navigate life and hit the goals that they set for themselves. Not only do they set high goals, but they stick to their goals, through difficulty. As opposed to someone with low self-efficacy, which could also be described as default helplessness, right? These people set weak goals for themselves. They're more likely to give up in the face of adversity, right? So there's a sort of a spectrum there. Locus of control, the perceived locus of control is the technical term, right? It's the deeply held belief that someone with an internal locus of control has a deeply held, mostly unconscious belief that I am responsible for my future and the outcomes of my life. Whereas someone with an external locus of control has a deeply held belief that fate or luck or circumstances or powerful others somehow have determined my life or control my life, right? But here again, we're not walking around saying, hi, my name's Gary. I have an external locus of control, but you can see it in the behavior. So these are beliefs that reside mostly beneath our conscious awareness. The third dimension is the fixed versus growth mindset. And this is the work of Carol Dweck at Stanford. A fixed mindset is someone who believes that our intelligence and our abilities are finite. We're hardwired, it's limited, and versus someone who believes our intelligence or our capabilities can be developed through deliberate practice, right? This underlying belief about our own abilities has an enormous impact on the goals we set for ourselves. And it's a super important factor. The fourth dimension is where's our source of motivation? Are we intrinsically motivated? Is the task itself the reward? Are we doing something for purpose and passion? Or are we extrinsically motivated? We're just doing it for the money or the power or the prestige. And lastly, resilience is the fifth dimension of an entrepreneurial mindset. And that our resilience stems from what psychologists call an optimistic or a pessimistic explanatory style. What's the story we tell ourselves when we find ourselves in challenging circumstances? Do we tell ourselves this always happens to me? This is, just my luck. This is the way it always goes. That's a pessimistic style. Or are we telling ourselves, I got to find a way, right? So those are the underlying dimensions of a mindset. Now, let's talk about the entrepreneurial mindset, right? So every entrepreneurial journey begins with this core assumption that it's my responsibility to figure out how to make myself useful to others. And by doing so, I can empower myself. That's sort of the genesis of entrepreneurial thought and process. I've got to figure out how to connect. I got to figure out how to make myself more useful in whatever circumstances I find myself in. And so another way to think about this is in entrepreneurial discovery, what we're encouraging, so we're facilitators or teachers, entrepreneurship educators, we're encouraged to, either in ourselves or our students, we're encouraging the pursuit of the intersection between our own natural interests, our innate abilities, and the needs of other humans. And it is in that intersection, in the overlap of those three things, that we become optimally engaged. When a human being is encouraged to pursue her own interests and develop her abilities in ways that contribute to the greater good, we don't need to be manipulated or coerced into doing that. We become intrinsically motivated and therefore optimally engaged. Another way to think about this, I'm going to use a diagram here that I adopted from Mihail Csikszentmihalyi, who is one of the co-founders of positive psychology. He wrote a very important book called Flow. Some of you might be familiar with that. Maybe Nick, you can put that in the show notes, a link to that book from Csikszentmihalyi. But it's basically, here we are in our current reality, and we set for ourselves a compelling goal. Now, what Csikszentmihalyi points out is that when the challenge exceeds our skill level, we become very anxious, right? And if the challenge is way up here, way above our skill level, we just kind of shut down. We call that, psychologists call that a state of high arousal. We just really can't even function, right? Now, on the other side of it, what happens when our skill exceeds the challenge? We become bored, right? And so what we see in the entrepreneurial journey, it's the compelling goal that elicits this optimal flow state, or what Csikszentmihalyi calls optimal engagement. We become optimally engaged in the pursuit of a compelling goal. So over time, as a result of pursuing a compelling goal in highly ambiguous, resource-constrained circumstances, the entrepreneurial mindset begins to emerge. We tend to see in experienced entrepreneurs a high degree of self-efficacy, an internal locus of control, a belief that I'm in charge of my own life, a growth mindset, right? Because I don't have any money, I'm forced to teach myself things that I could otherwise hire people to do, right? And as a result, I develop a growth mindset. I've got to teach myself about legal, about accounting, about marketing, and so forth, because I don't have the money to pay these people. I become intrinsically motivated because I'm seeing my work impact other people, right? I become optimally engaged. I become intrinsically motivated. And I tend to become highly resilient. It's the compelling nature of the goal that keeps us in the game, that keeps us sort of with an optimistic outlook. So, excuse me, those are the 5 dimensions, the 5 critical dimensions of an entrepreneurial mindset. The point that I really want to make here is very, very simple, is that the entrepreneurial, mindset is an effect of entrepreneurial behavior. It's not the cause, right? So the cause of entrepreneurial behavior, the impulse that causes us to say step into the entrepreneurial arena is our innate tendency towards growth, right? This is what the humanist psychologists call like the self-actualizing tendency, right? That's in every human. I just tweeted something about this yesterday. Like, the entrepreneurial spirit is the human spirit. It's not just in some of us, it's in all of us, right? So it's the need to grow and expand and to become all that we can become, just like every other living thing, that puts us in the arena. The entrepreneurial mindset is the result of operating in the arena. So the point here is that, people go out and interview successful entrepreneurs, and they come back and they write these articles and they say, well, in order to be a successful entrepreneur, you've got to have these 5 things or these 7 things or these 10 things or whatever. And they've got it all wrong, right? Because if you went back and you looked at the entrepreneur when they began, they had little or none of that. They didn't know what the hell they were doing. They'd have much less confidence. They were much less self-confident. They were much more uncertain. It evolved as a result. And so in psychology, we call this a fundamental attribution error. We're assigning the wrong cause to the effect, right? I'm not saying everyone's cut out to start a high growth business, but we're all naturally inclined to be innovative and entrepreneurial. So I want to augment my definition of entrepreneurship as the self-directed pursuit of opportunities to create value for others. And by creating value for others, we empower ourselves. We empower ourselves in myriad ways, not only in economic terms, but by creating value for others, we tap into the most potent form of human motivation. It's called intrinsic motivation, right? All right. So I'm going to pause now for a couple of minutes here, Nick, and take some questions. I'm just sort of the first 3 of the 4 points in our webinar today. So
yeah, absolutely. We've got a great meaty question to start things off while other folks type theirs out. But this is from Robert. Israel Kirzner defined entrepreneurial mindset as an awareness and discovery of disequilibrium in local or global socioeconomic environments to then devise actions to address those opportunities. Redefining an entrepreneurial mindset to simply serve others seems somehow to not be what Kirzner meant. What is addressing disequilibrium in your Schoeniger's definition?
So I appreciate that question, and I'm not sure what you mean by disequilibrium. So if you could expand on that, maybe we can come back to that question. I'd greatly appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. I did have some initial thoughts on that. My understanding of disequilibrium, basically, we define that in our work often as unmet or undermet needs within society or the economy. So in other words, that's a fancier way of saying finding something that is being inadequately addressed or not addressed at all. That could be something as simple as a new widget or item to something quite large, like something like systemic racism or anything under the sun, really.
Yeah. It's an interesting question, and I'm not sure if I'm going to answer this properly or not, but I was just talking to Nick about this just before we got in this webinar, that it's not that there's a shortage of opportunities. It's not that that opportunities are hard to find. It's that they're easy to overlook.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because we're not trained to think in those terms. There's like 7 billion people on the planet, and most of us are walking around with unarticulated, unmet needs. But we don't have like placards. We're not holding up signs saying like, hey, somebody make me a $5 latte, right? So there are just different attitudes and different skills required to tease out these opportunities that are latent in almost any situation. They just require like attitudes and skills that are unfamiliar to most. They require attitudes and skills that have historically been neglected or overlooked or ignored in our systems of education or certainly undervalued historically in our organizational structures.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions about those first 3 sections? And if not, that's okay. We will have plenty of time at the end as well. Okay, Linda is asking, the entrepreneurial skill sets are badly needed, especially in government employees. Why is it that the push toward entrepreneurial ventures are identified as new workforce development systems, but there's virtually no training? Interesting question, Linda.
It's a great question, Linda. And it's again, like people don't understand entrepreneurship. They hear the word entrepreneur, they think it's a high growth entrepreneurship, or they think of a small, so they think it's irrelevant, right? They don't understand like and really, we're looking at it as a behavioral phenomenon, not as a business discipline. So that's really what helped me redefine it, is thinking of it from a behavioral perspective. But what your comment or your question also kind of brings to mind is that our behavior is the result of the person and the situation. And so part of the message and the work at Eli, what we're saying is this, two things. We're saying to the individual that, look, you've got to figure out how to make yourself useful, regardless of the circumstances. And that's really what our book is about. You've got to figure out how to make yourself useful. You can't be blaming your boss, the world, your parents, your kids, whatever. You can't be saying, like, I want to do cool things, but the world won't let me. I don't have enough money. I don't have the brains. I don't have the credentials. Like, we're kind of trying to knock you off that line of thinking. At the same time, we're saying to organizational leaders, to educators, to parents, to academic leaders, stop blaming your children, your students, your workforce for their lack of engagement, and look at the systems you've created and the extent to which those systems contribute to the outcomes that you're getting, to that lack of engagement, right? I think it was Drucker or Deming, maybe. It was Deming who said, like, every system is perfectly designed to get the outcomes it's getting. So that's another way to think about that.
Absolutely. We've got a couple good questions about that apply to what we've already talked about, and then another few that are definitely going to come up in this next section. So starting, what is the importance of an entrepreneurial mindset to someone who wants to be employed rather than be the business owner? And then dovetailing to that, what age should entrepreneurship education be taught and how?
Yeah. So for someone who wants to be employed, like, how can they, like, can you help me reframe that question again, Nick? For someone that wants to be employed, why is it important?
Yeah. What is the importance of an entrepreneurial mindset to someone? Basically, what's the importance of intrapreneurship as opposed to entrepreneurship?
Well, I come back to the idea that we all live by exchanging. And regardless of whether you're in an established organization or you're out in the wilderness with a sharp stick on your own, the point is, the more useful you become, the better off you're going to be. So let's say, for example, in one scenario, you have someone who says, like, I don't even want to think. I just want to do what my employer tells me to do and go home and forget about the end of the day. That's fine. If that's working for you, God bless you. Go forward in peace. You have my blessing. Beautiful, right? But when you get to the point where that's not working, where you feel stuck, where you feel dissatisfied, where you feel like you're not living up to your full potential, you might start looking around and ask yourself, like, where's the intersection between my interest, my abilities, and how can I make myself more useful to this organization, right? And the more useful you become, the better off you're likely to be. And I'm, again, not saying this better off economically, but psychologically, right? You're liable to experience more psychological well-being and social integration by figuring out how to make yourself more useful to other humans. And the second part of that was, how early should it start? Like first grade, right? Stop asking kids what they want to be when they grow up and start asking them what problems they want to solve and what do they need to learn in order to solve those problems.
Absolutely. Okay, that's good. All right, looking at the time, let's keep trucking along, Gare, and then we can get to these other questions that have come up at the end.
Okay, so now I'm going to talk about how to, like, I've given you some background. Like, we redefined entrepreneurship as the self-directed pursuit of opportunity to create value for others. And by creating value for others, we empower ourselves. And as I said, it requires attitudes, behaviors, and skills that anyone can learn to develop. There's simply attitudes, behaviors, and skills that have historically been overlooked, undervalued, or ignored within our systems of education. We talk a little bit about the entrepreneurial mindset and identify the critical dimensions of an entrepreneurial mindset. We talked about how the entrepreneurial mindset is more so the effect of the behavior or the effect of the pursuit rather than the cause of the behavior. Now I want to talk about, so part of the point that I'm making here is humans are just like acorns. They're just like every other living thing on the planet. We all have within us an innate drive to become all that we can become, right? We have this innate tendency towards growth, towards social integration and psychological well-being. But this innate tendency towards growth and self-actualization requires the right environment. It requires like psychological and physiological nutriments in order to experience that. So I'm going to talk about some of the psychological nutrients, which are in order to foster lifelong growth, integration, and well-being, we need three basic things. We need autonomy, we need to become competent, and we need to have something called relatedness. You might have heard this as autonomy, competency, autonomy, mastery, and purpose is another way of thinking about this. Those are the essential ingredients with which to cultivate growth and the growth tendency. So in 2008, I did a project for the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute in San Jose, California. I was hired to do a gap analysis on the entrepreneurship education ecosystem in the United States, and then to create some content around the mindset. But one of the things I found straight away in this research project at Cisco was that the way that entrepreneurship is typically characterized in a classroom or a learning environment, a formal learning environment, is largely divorced from the day-to-day reality of what a typical entrepreneur is doing. And so Cisco gave me the platform to go across the US with a film crew and interview hundreds of entrepreneurs, what I call unlikely entrepreneurs. And that's where I met my co-author, Clifton Talbert. I stumbled into his office by chance in Tulsa, Oklahoma. All I knew about Mr. Talbert at the time was that he was one of the founders of the Stairmaster Exercise Company. I had no idea he was a Pulitzer nominee, he'd done all these other amazing things. But when I asked him, how did you become an entrepreneur? Did someone influence you? Was there some experience in your life that put you on an entrepreneurial trajectory? He pulled this photograph out of a shoebox and he said, this was my Uncle Cleve. And he explained to me that he came of age in the Mississippi Delta he was born in the 1940s to a teenage mother, came of age in the 1950s. And he said, he was picking cotton. He said, for people that look like me, that was the expected way of life at this time and place. And he explained that when he was 13 years old, he was invited to work alongside his Uncle Cleve, who owned the local ice house. And that's just a quick backstory. That's where the name of the book came from. But this is the story that really captured what I was trying to explain and really showed the sort of the bare bones simplicity of entrepreneurship. And a couple of years later, Clifton and I wound up co-authoring the book, Who Owns the Ice House? The subtitle is 8 Life Lessons from an Unlikely Entrepreneur. It's really 8 core concepts or competencies that we distilled from hundreds of interviews. It's told through a single story. And then with some initial funding from the Kauffman Foundation, we created the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program, which has gone all over the world. It's been taught in multiple languages around the world. I'll tell you a little bit about that. We now have 4 editions. There's the original edition, the Student Success Edition, which is designed for high school seniors or college freshmen as a freshman seminar student success course to expose them to an entrepreneurial mindset to succeed in school and in life. There's a small business edition, and most recently in the last year, we released the middle school edition after a very successful 2-year pilot in Erie, Pennsylvania school district, about 1,600 middle school kids. So the course objectives are pretty straightforward. We want to redefine entrepreneurship, as I did here, so that students can understand its relevance and applicability across the domains. We want to inspire the students with real world examples. We want to engage them in the process. We want to focus on the mindset and its broad applicability. When you get to the mindset, what are the underlying beliefs and assumptions that are driving the behavior? That's really where the learning occurs. We wanted to connect the classroom with the entrepreneurial community. And lastly, we wanted to develop a course that was facilitated, does not require the facilitator to become a subject matter expert as an entrepreneur, like Exhale. That's a really important thing we found in our Cisco research, that the programs that were the most effective were led by serial entrepreneurs, people that have built, multiple businesses. They knew it intuitively. So we developed a program. The Ice House program is designed that this isn't so much, a testament to our brilliance. It's very simple, straightforward. When you recognize that entrepreneurship is a discovery process, then you realize you don't really need to be an expert. You need to understand how to facilitate discovery because you don't know where it's going to go. So it's really a straightforward idea. When we look at entrepreneurs in the wild, what we see are 4 core learning models. We see experiential learning, we see project-based learning, peer-to-peer learning, and self-directed learning. And this is David Kolb's model of experiential learning. I have an experience, a problem, a frustration I encounter. I dig into the problem a little bit. I start to conceptualize a solution. I experiment with the solution. I learn from the results and rinse and repeat, right? That's exactly what entrepreneurs tend to do naturally in the wild. It also very closely mirrors project-based learning, which is student-centered. The students pick the problems that they're going to solve. It occurs in small groups. The teacher is the facilitator, not the subject matter expert. The problems are introduced early in the learning process. It's the problems that stimulate problem-solving skills and new knowledge is obtained. The key thing here to understand is that it's the ill-structured nature of the problem that helps develop the entrepreneurial attitudes and skills. Ill-structured problems don't have a single right answer, right? They're open-ended, complex, they mirror the real world, they require collaboration, they evolve with new information, they spark interest and controversy, and they engage questions, right? Very often students of the Ice House program become frustrated early on because their whole lives they've been told what the problem is and where the answers can be found. And now we're not only are we not telling them what the answers are, we're not even telling them what the problems are. We're making them go out and find the problems and find the answers. Peer-to-peer learning also very closely mirrors what we see entrepreneurs doing. And they're learning from each other. They sort of form these informal like communities of practice, right? What we know about peer-to-peer learning, this comes from a guy named Eric Missouri, who was at Harvard and it's for teaching physics and published some very interesting research about the way in which peer-to-peer learning increases knowledge retention by turning passive note-taking students into active de facto teachers who explain their ideas to each other. That is a super important part of entrepreneurship education, right? In this study that I've cited here, they also point out that peer-to-peer learning increases student retention. The dropout rate goes way down when we apply peer-to-peer learning. And lastly, it's self-directed learning. And using what we learned from Gerald Groh and others, we designed the Ice House methodology to help move a student from a state of as a dependent learner to interested, involved, and ultimately self-directed. There are some basic core components, very simple. Expose the students to the 8 core concepts, immerse them in real-world experiences, reinforce the behavior with relatable examples, and encourage personal reflection. So I'll start with the 8 core concepts. These are the 8 core concepts we distilled from hundreds of interviews, right? It begins with a foundation of choice. When you interview any entrepreneur, they'll start to articulate a compelling goal, some sort of a vision, something that they feel compelled to pursue. I can't overestimate the power of that first concept, right? What they're doing on from a psychological perspective is orienting their minds towards a future positive orientation. We know from the literature that hope, which is the belief that the future will be better than the present, coupled with the belief that I have the power to make it so, that hope is the best predictor of how someone will perform in school or at work, more so than IQ, SAT, GPA, anything. Hope is the greatest predictor of success. What we see in entrepreneurs is the tendency to see problems as opportunities. Every problem, frustration, and unmet need is sort of looked at as a potential opportunity. And it's very different from the way most of us are taught to think. We notice in the entrepreneur a bias towards action. And what they're really doing is micro experimenting, right? Planning doesn't work for the unfunded entrepreneur. You can't plan to solve a mystery. You have to behave like a detective, to try lots of things, lots and lots of micro experiments. We also notice that these entrepreneurs tended to be avid learners, not necessarily learning by traditional means, but they're YouTube subscribers, they're Audible subscribers, they're reading, they're taking courses online, they're networking with other entrepreneurs, they're learning from their own experiments and their own experience, but they tend to be voracious learners. So we see this as sort of the core of entrepreneurial activity. We're looking for problems to solve, we're trying lots of things, and we're learning all the time. Looking for problems to solve, trying lots of things, and always learning. As a result, we become very resourceful. We learn how to invest our discretionary time, thought, resources, rather than spend. We become reliable, right? We learn how to generate our own luck. We build a brand where opportunities start to come to us. We create a support network of a learning community. And we learn to develop an optimistic outlook, which is the basis for the resilience that I talked about earlier, the persistence. So those are the 8 core concepts that we expose students to in the Ice House program. Then we immerse them in real-world experiences. Again, we immerse them in the self-directed pursuit of opportunities to create value for others, right? How do they cross that chasm? How do they find the opportunities? We took Alexander Osterwalder's business model canvas and sort of reworked it to broaden its scope and broke the process down into 3 basic categories. It's problem finding, then it's experimentation and adaptation. And then once we have evidence that we have a solution, again, this is an evidence-based process, then and only then do we begin to advocate for the idea. So the students are required to jot down their basic assumptions in these boxes here, and there's some guiding questions. And then we encourage them to get out of the building in small teams and talk to people who have the problem they're trying to solve, discuss it with them, learn to ask questions, listen, modify the canvas, and come back. And they're constantly doing this in an iterative learning process, right? They learn about the problem. Once they understand the problem, then they start designing experiments, right? So they're going through problem solution, until they have evidence of usefulness, right? It's an evidence-based process. And when you look at what entrepreneurs are doing, they're actually mirroring the scientific method. Once you have evidence, then you kick into the advocacy and implementation. One of the great myths out there is that good ideas sell themselves, and nothing can be further from the truth. So that's sort of a quick overview of the real world application of the process. Then we reinforce the behavior with case studies, and we're showing students over and over and over, students, the learning is reinforced with short video vignettes of what we call relatable social models. They need to learn from people who have come from similar or worse circumstances in order to adopt this new behavior. So they're learning from a pretty wide variety of people that have overcome all manner of adversity, from Dawn Haffiker, a severely disabled veteran, Jason, a foster kid, Ryan Blair, a gangbanger from LA. This is Brian Scudamore, 1-800-GOT-JUNK founder, started it when he was 18 years old with $1,000. Rodney Walker took an entrepreneurial mindset as a dropout, applied it to learning. He's now at Harvard pursuing a doctorate in education. These are former students of the Ice House program. This is a father and daughter talking about how they, from inner city Philly, talked about taking $200 and creating a cleaning company that went to more than $1 million in sales. So that's just a small smattering of the examples, but it's the real world examples that make it real for the students. And then lastly, we encourage personal reflection, right? And I'm going to come back to my definition of a mindset as the deeply ingrained beliefs and assumptions and mental models that hinder or enhance our ability to adapt. So using Deming's definition of a system is perfectly designed that I mentioned earlier, what we're saying to the student is that a mindset is a belief system, one that is perfectly designed to create the outcomes it's creating, right? So we're asking students to take time to pause and reflect on their life, to think about their own thinking and try to make those connections. How are our deepest beliefs and assumptions connected to the outcomes we're creating? So that's a quick overview of how it works. The program has been used in ways we could have never imagined: middle and high school, community colleges, four-year universities, economic development initiatives, veteran initiatives, small business programs, re-entry programs, workforce development, learning and development in large corporations, nonprofits around the world have deployed Ice House in one way or another over the last decade. Since we launched in 2011, we've trained more than 2,700 facilitators around the world. On our website, you can connect with those facilitators all on our website, and this map is on our website. Program has been featured on NPR, in CNN, on USA Today, Huffington Post. A few years ago, Tom Rue, when he was at the Kauffman Foundation, was invited to present the Ice House to the United Nations and to the Vatican as a way to eradicate poverty in Africa. So some quick highlights here. The middle school project in Erie, Pennsylvania. Here's some of the testimonials that came from some of these kids. They're 12 or 13-year-old kids. And this girl, Madison Porter, is saying, if we all think about how we can change problems into opportunities, we can change our community, right? This is coming out of the mouth of a 13-year-old girl. A very wide network, a private high school network in Mexico, Prepa Tech, about 7,500 students a year. We're going through, they put about 7,500 students a year, high school students, their final semester through the Ice House program right before they went into the university. One thing we never really anticipated was the Ice House program being used as a student success program. And it was the visionary, the leadership of Dr. Lance Bolton at Pikes Peak Community College, where he said that this will work as a student success program. And 1,000 student survey in a blind study, we saw a 28% bump in student persistence. So in community colleges, half the students that show up in the fall aren't there in the spring semester. The students of the Ice House program, it increased that by 28% over the control group. We're seeing Ice House deployed in city government applications, and this is an initiative led in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, by a guy named Tom Darling, who was at CNM, Community College in New Mexico. when the mayor came and said, we want to put city government workers through this Ice House program. They started with 100. They were so impressed with the outcome. They're now in the process of putting all 6,000 city government workers through the Ice House program. I mentioned Tom Rue a moment ago. He was the former vice president of entrepreneurship at Kauffman. He was our champion at Kauffman that brought us into the Kauffman Foundation, really helped bring Ice House to life. He's now running a foundation in North Carolina called the NC Idea Foundation. That's Tom's smiling face right up here in the upper left-hand corner. They have committed to empowering 100,000 North Carolinians with an entrepreneurial mindset using the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program. To date, they've trained about 2,500 facilitators who are now taking Ice House into their elementary schools, high schools, community colleges, universities, nonprofit organizations all across North Carolina. I seriously encourage you to look up NCID and the innovative things that are happening there. So that's it. That's a quick overview of the Ice House program, and I hope that gives you a framework for how to create effective entrepreneurial learning environments. Again, we are the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. We offer keynotes, workshops, professional development programs. We have entrepreneurial leadership programs, faculty and professional development, and workforce development programs. You can learn more about that at elimindset.com. If you want to engage with us, a simple thing you can do is you can buy the book, Who Owns the Ice House? It's on Amazon, it's in Kindle, it's in paperback, it's in hardcover, it's in Audible. You can see the ratings on Amazon right away. We've sold more than 50,000 copies of that book since we launched. There's a self-paced version of the course. If you're a little more curious, you can go to our website. You can sign up for the self-paced version of the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program. We've reduced the price to $99. It's a 10-hour program. It's packed full of videos from the interviews we've done around the world of the entrepreneurs. It'll walk you through a deeper dive into the 8 life lessons. If you want to learn how to bring this program to your community, if you just want to learn how to become a more effective entrepreneurship educator, you can come to our public facilitator training. Our next one is in February. I think it's February 1st or 2nd. I can't remember, but it's a 4-week intensive online program. We typically get 40 or 50 people from around the world. Last one we just wrapped up a couple of weeks ago. We had people from Mongolia attending, from Australia, from South Africa. So if you want to learn how to bring this program or become a better Ice House or a better entrepreneurship educator, you can take that training. And of course, you can learn more at elimindset.com. Now, my voice is getting hoarse, so I'm going to stop talking and see what questions we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. This has been great. And the chat has been very active. A lot of it with stuff that I was able to answer. But someone asked early on when you were starting to tell the story of Who Owns the Ice House, why you and Clifton chose the term unlikely to describe Uncle Cleve. And I gave the basic response, which is the system was quite literally designed to hold him back in the Jim Crow South, the segregated South of the 1950s in America. But I wanted to see if you had any other insights into the use of the term unlikely.
Well, I kind of, that's a great question. And thank you for the question. And Nick, your answer is 100% accurate. But I also wanted to knock people off of the Mark Zuckerberg image of an entrepreneur, and as it happened, probably a third of the people that we've interviewed said something to me the effect of, I've never thought of myself as an entrepreneur. They didn't even self-identify as an entrepreneur. So it's just, it's the not typical entrepreneur is what I'm really trying to say. Unlikely is perhaps a better term.
Sure. Could you talk a little bit more about how our online training is structured? We had a few questions about how to engage with the content. Actually, before you answer that, Brian asked what languages are available. primarily English. We do have the book translated into Spanish and have a variety of the course elements translated into Spanish. We're working on making that a little more robust in the coming year. But right now, primarily English with some Spanish.
Yeah, we worked with the University of Pontificia Universidad Javeriana in Bogota, and they made a Colombian version that has Colombian entrepreneurs in it. That's all translated into Spanish. If that's helpful to you. That's also available. So there's
Absolutely.
that. And there was another question in there, Nick.
Sorry. If you could just expand a little bit more on the details of our online facilitator training in terms of what that looks like and what folks are going to get out of it. We just had a couple questions about how to engage with the content and bring it to programs that folks are using around the world.
Yeah. So the training is, let's see, how do we answer that one, Nick? So the training is really, first of all, like a deeper dive in understanding the theoretical constructs, right? That like redefining entrepreneurship in a way. There's a concept that's we offer a framework for understanding entrepreneurship as distinct from business. We will go deeply into the mindset, as well as the situational factors that either encourage or inhibit the development of entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills. We'll immerse you more deeply in the Ice House content. We'll invite you to organize in small teams, to actually become students of the Ice House program and get out of the building and start looking for and solving problems in your sphere of influence, in your world, in your community, in your organization, whatever it may be. That's kind of a broad overview. Maybe Link, you can put Nick, you can put a link in the show notes there to the description of the training. They're on the registration page.
Yep, and that'll be in the follow-up email as well, but I'll toss that in the chat right now.
Yeah.
There's
here's what happens. I'll tell you now anecdotally. What happens so often to training is folks come to the training and they're coming to the training expecting to learn how to deliver a program, but what they're not expecting is to be personally impacted. And the two most prominent things people say about the training is, this was life-changing. This was a transformational experience. Like, people are personally impacted by this work.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with those assessments. I went ahead and tossed the link to the February training Gary was mentioning, as well as a link to our tentative agenda for that training, which it will give you kind of a bird's eye view of what the 4 weeks will look like in terms of expected work and things like that. I believe you already mentioned this, Gary, but I'll highlight it again. Training is a combination of live lectures. We'll be meeting once a day on Wednesdays throughout the month of February for an hour and a half, similar to this session, talking about content that folks will have consumed throughout the week prior to that meeting. So that'll include things like recorded lectures from Gary himself, as well as our president, Rob Herndon, reading of the book, Who Owns the Ice House, reading of supplemental resources, and doing some reflection assignments and participating in online discussion forums, as well as, especially in the latter half of the training, actually working through the opportunity discovery canvas that Gary briefly mentioned in this last section of the webinar. But I think that's a fairly comprehensive overview. Any other questions, folks? Or any questions that I answered that you'd like us to revisit with Gary's input?
So, Nick, I want to address a question here from Jobert Nguyen, who is from Zimbabwe. First of all, Jobert, I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly. Welcome. I'm very, very grateful that you attended our webinar. I think the best thing to do is there's a number of ways you can get into the curriculum. The first step is to become a trained facilitator. And Nick is probably the person to follow up with on that one. He's really the client engagement guy on our team.
Absolutely. The first step there is to check out the event details in that link I posted so that you can have a better understanding of what's expected. Happy to chat about that. One thing both of us forgot to mention is the intention is to make this as accessible to folks as possible, understanding that there are many time zones throughout the world. So if you're unable to attend the sessions live, everything will be recorded. So if you're only able to attend maybe the first or the last session live just to interact with us directly in a live format, that's fantastic. But it's by no means a complete requirement. Like I said, everything's going to be recorded, and you'll have continued access to that for a month or two after the fact, so that you'll better be able to dive deeply into the concepts that Gary was outlining a moment ago.
So also, Nick, I want to address Melissa Levy's question here. Are these case studies or stories? I do better with stories. I'd love to understand how it works in real life. They're stories, Melissa. They're not like a formal case study. They're what we've done is like these 8 core concepts that we observed, and they're just little video vignettes from some of the entrepreneurs, and they're sort of reinforcing the concept in their own words from their own experience. So that's, probably using the word case study is probably not the best. They're really stories. We also encourage you and the students of the program, you as the facilitator and your students, to invite local entrepreneurs into the learning experience. So that's super important, Melissa. Look, you can read the book, right? Here's a historic story. It's a story of the mid-century Mississippi Delta, the height of legal segregation. For younger people, it might as well be ancient history. They can see more modern examples of unlikely entrepreneurs in the video vignettes. But when you invite these unlikely entrepreneurs into the classroom, into the learning experience, like the stuff gets real. And that's really an important factor in sort of awakening the student to the possibility of entrepreneurial thinking. When they see people from their own communities embodying these concepts, they'll start to connect with an idea, maybe this is possible for me.
Thanks for expanding on that one. An important point that Jill brought up, she unfortunately had to leave, but I thought it was an interesting point of conversation to maybe close with here. She said, I've recently struggled with whether initiative is learned or born, or something you're born with. I'm seeing through your program it's learned, but possibly as a child in an environment with parents as teachers, modeling the behavior that they want to see. She says, I have employees that seem to have zero initiative and some that seem to have more naturally born gifts. And full disclosure, Jill is a trained facilitator of ours. So as she's worked through the program and been thinking about these concepts, she's still kind of grappling with that almost nature versus nurture type question.
Yeah. So thank you for posing that, even though Jill's not with us. It's a good question. Our entrepreneurs made or born. I hear it all the time. I'm going to come back to a term that I used earlier. It's called the fundamental attribution error. It's a tendency to overemphasize the importance of dispositional traits while ignoring the social, environmental, and situational factors that exert enormous influence on our behavior, mostly without our awareness. So I'll answer Jill's question differently. In my research, what I've come to believe is that non-entrepreneurial behavior is learned. And so we're all naturally inclined, we're all born naturally curious with the ability to identify and solve problems. We're also innately driven to want to contribute to the greater good. I mean, those are natural things. We don't need to be manipulated into doing that. We'll do that naturally. Doesn't mean we need to own a business. Now, we see people who are not motivated. I don't know if I have the time to get into that, but what I would say is Google search the term learned helplessness, right? There's a default helpless orientation where we have deeply held belief that nothing we do will matter. And so that's where we see people that seem to not be motivated. It may very well be, if you go back to my iceberg analogy, that they're suffering from this what was once called learned helplessness. We now know it's not learned, that it's sort of a default, evolutionary default mechanism. But when we come to believe that nothing we do will matter, we have this helpless orientation. One of the devastating effects of helplessness is that it blinds us to opportunities. One of the side effects of helplessness is the inability to recognize a solution when it's unambiguously presented, right? So Ice House is actually designed to help move someone from a helpless to a mastery orientation. And in the training, there's very specific guidelines called guided mastery. It comes from the work of Albert Bandura in self-efficacy. This guided mastery is exactly how you help someone move from a helpless to a mastery orientation. Robert Williams, studies of entrepreneurial working class versus wage earning class are also illuminating. Absolutely, Robert. I'm really glad you brought that up. I mean, that's really what our work is about. It's about illuminating. I love that word. It's really about illuminating the extraordinary ability of ordinary people. And one of the concepts I'm still grappling with is that there's this sort of a paradox, right? I think what's happening here is the unlikely entrepreneur, these underdogs, if you will, they're actually turning their adversity into an advantage. I don't think they're doing that deliberately, or consciously, but they're actually using their lack of experience, their lack of resources, their lack of credentials actually becomes an advantage in this highly ambiguous pursuit of opportunities.
And Robert kind of expands actually exactly on the point you're just making. Some people see a malfunctioning car as a welcome challenge to be fixed. Others do not. Likewise, addressing disequilibrium or solving problems, as we talked about before, is a welcome challenge for some and not for others. Entrepreneurs are folks that like the challenge. I think we would posit, though, that anyone can shift their mindset towards that. And it's in fact avoiding the challenge is something that we learn, and challenge is innately something that we all are meant to evolutionarily address.
Yes, and Robert, your comment speaks to the concept of self-efficacy. Nick, if you could do me a favor and post that, if you Google search Stanford Albert Bandura self-efficacy, that 3-page document that Bandura wrote lays it out beautifully. And that's really what he said, Robert, is that people with high self-efficacy beliefs relish a challenge, where people with low self-efficacy beliefs avoid challenge. So I think that I tweeted that paper yesterday, the day before yesterday. It's probably one of the most insightful papers I've ever read when it comes to understanding the entrepreneurial mindset. It's a very brief discussion of self-efficacy beliefs from Albert Bandura.
I actually just found one that's a 15-page paper, so I'll post that as well.
If you can't do it in 3 pages, you might as well do it in 15. Yeah, that's
5 times the fun.
I appreciated the Stanford piece because it's.
Oh, that's from Stanford as well. It's just an expanded version.
The piece that I mentioned, because it's succinct.
Yep.
I mean, you could read the first page and you get it. Like people who have high self-efficacy beliefs, here's how they benefit. And he lists all the ways in which you'll benefit. People who have low self-efficacy beliefs, here's all the ways you'll suffer. And he lays all that out. Now, then he goes into how to move somebody from from low self-efficacy to high self-efficacy. That was instrumental in our development of the Ice House program.
Certainly.
And Robert, you know, the other thing, this is sort of I'm parsing with you now, but like, this is I'm going to use your comment here as a situational factor, right? Some people will see a malfunctioning car as a welcome challenge to be fixed, depending on your way to the wedding, or if you just like you get nothing to do on a Sunday afternoon.
Exactly.
Right. So if you're on your way to the hospital, or if you got nothing to do, it's a situational thing. But thank you for that comment. I very much appreciate it.
All right. Well, that's us at 90 minutes. Thanks everyone who stayed on during this kind of extended Q&A session. If you have any other questions, feel free to respond to the follow-up email that's going to go out probably later this afternoon, just depending on how long it takes for the video to upload. And that'll include, like I mentioned, the recording of the session, the slides, a couple links to what's been going on, or what we've been talking about throughout this, and plenty of other useful information. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you being here. Appreciate the dialogue, the questions, the comments, all of it. If there's anything we can do to help support your entrepreneurship education initiatives, please reach out. And have a happy, wonderful holiday.
Thanks all.